CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Live from London, this is Global Business.
Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Jamie Owen.
And I'm Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. Protests and strikes across France over government plans to raise the age of retirement. We're live in Paris.
Our other headlines, the US government hits its $31 trillion borrowing limit amid a standoff between Republicans and Democrats.
The defence chiefs of the United States and Germany head for a showdown over weapons that Kyiv says could decide the war.
We're live in Davos, where we've been talking to the president of Ecuador about trade relations with China.
And so today I'm announcing that I will not be seeking re-election.
New Zealand's Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern says she's stepping down in a surprise move months ahead of an election.
France has ground to a standstill with strikes across the country in protest against the government's planned pension reform.
Unions have organised nationwide action, the first time in 12 years that all of the country's labour organisations have united. President Macron wants to raise retirement age in the country from 62 to 64. Macron's reforms are being seen as a make or break for his second term as president.
Let's talk to our correspondent Ollie Barrett in Paris. Ollie, the unions have called for what they describe a massive mobilisation. What does it look like where you are? What does it look like on the ground?
Yeah, well, the crowds here in the Place de la République in the centre of Paris beginning to thin now. There is some encouragement from street-sweeping vans for them to do so, and police are trying to move people on as well. But there were tens of thousands of people out in Paris through the day. And we've also got some early estimates in from authorities elsewhere in the country. Officials saying 40,000 people protested in Lyon, 30,000 in Toulouse, 26,000 in Marseille. So, as you say, unions were calling for this national day of action, and it looks like that's what they got. Black Thursday or Hellish Thursday, whatever you call it, it's a significant moment for President Macron's attempts at pension reforms. Polls suggest nearly 70% of French people oppose the plans, and those who've taken to the streets have the strongest views.
We're protesting against the retirement age changing from 62 to 64. In what state are we going to end? In a wheelchair? There's enough money to keep the system as it is.
We'll continue the protests for as long as we need to. They're going to vote on the bill in early February at the Parliament. We'll be there protesting.
The French government says reform is needed as the population ages or the pension system won't survive. From 2027, most people would have to work 43 years to qualify for the full pension. At the moment, it's 42.
The number of working people compared to the number of pensioners is falling. In 2005, there were 2 working people for every pensioner. Today, there are 1.7, and tomorrow, 1.5. We must therefore restore the balance of our pension system.
President Macron's grouping has no majority in Parliament, so he hopes to win support from the Republicans Party to get the legislation passed. But those out protesting today hope the demonstrations up and down the country and the sheer scale of the numbers will show the president the strength of feeling about his reforms. It's the first time in over a decade rival unions have joined forces for walkouts across swathes of the economy, from transport to education to hospitals and oil refineries. They insist that the proposals are unfair and will punish the poorest the most, and they promise they won't back down.
I know that people often attack the unions. Well, I think that today we can say thank you to them. They were able to show a united front despite their differences.
So there's every chance this Black Thursday won't be the last. Well, certainly a significant day for Emmanuel Macron, the French president, as well. The very credibility of his second term on the line. He knows that if he can't get this pension reform through, it really will lead to all sorts of questions about what he will be able to achieve in that second term now that he doesn't have that parliamentary majority. There have been sporadic outbreaks of trouble. We've seen reports of cars being torched in Rennes, tear gas being used in places, clashes with police in some French cities too, and certainly things aren't over here quite yet, even if the crowds are starting to thin. Going back to Emmanuel Macron, actually not in the country at the moment, in Spain for diplomatic meetings, but he's been asked there about what's unfolding in his country today. He doesn't appear to be backing down. We must do that reform, he says. We will do it with respect, in a spirit of dialogue, but also determination and responsibility, he says.
Ollie, thank you for that. Our correspondent, Ollie Barrett in Paris.
Let's talk now to Tomasz Mikalski, who's Associate Professor of Economics at HEC Paris Business School. Good to have you with us. So President Macron clearly committed to his pension reforms, but as we've seen, there are a lot of people in France. Polls suggest 70% oppose them. So who's going to win in this standoff?
So, good afternoon. So, in general, the numbers that we are seeing today that are flowing in about the number of protesters are similar to what we've seen in December 2019. Polling, if you look at the nitty-gritty there, isn't really much different. All comes down whether he can push it down for the parliament or not. And it seems that with the support of Les Républicains, if history repeats itself, he will be able to do it, and even better than the last time, where the reform passed through a special procedure that didn't require a vote in the parliament.
The protesters want France to not raise the pension age, of course. Can France afford to not raise it?
So for the time being, the reform could be postponed by, say, a year, 2 or 4, but I guess it is inevitable. Simply the life expectancy is much higher than when the system was programmed. People are living in good health, and then they also need to work a little bit longer. To that, what's being added, there's just the math is unfortunately unforgiving. As it was mentioned in your material earlier, there are much fewer workers per pensioners that we're going to have in the future.
So what do you think an agreement on this pension issue might look like?
So first of all, there are going to be certainly some adjustments about how to, when you raise this retirement age, how to make older people work. This may be a prelude to some further labor market reforms that are especially aimed to incentivize retaining, retraining of older workers. Furthermore, there are some other issues that can be moved. For example, how arduous a job is. Certain groups of workers may obtain additional privileges based on how, for example, detrimental to health a given occupation is.
And this has been described as a make or break issue for Macron, hasn't it? If he doesn't push these reforms through, what does that mean for him, both in terms of popularity and for the rest of his political agenda?
So I don't think he's going to lose any more in terms of backing than he has now. His polling is pretty low. However, what is at stake is whether he can forge some kind of an agreement with Les Républicains, that is a center-right party that is on the right of his own, in order to push some other supply-side reforms. On paper, and because were talks already held, looks possible. If not, probably what we're going to see is a dissolution of the parliament, and he's going to play va-banque later in this year, and then to try to get a new parliament where perhaps his party is going to get a majority at the expense of Les Républicains if they don't cooperate.
Tomasz Mikalski from HEC Paris Business School. Good to talk to you today. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.
The British inventor James Dyson has accused the British government of short-sightedness in its approach to business. The billionaire, who was an outspoken supporter of Brexit, said Prime Minister Rishi Sunak's policies are encouraging businesses to transfer jobs and invest outside the UK. His comments in the Daily Telegraph follow the government's autumn announcement of nearly $31 billion in tax rises.
Japan's export growth has slowed sharply as China-bound shipments fell for the first time in 7 months. Total exports in December still rose 11.5% year-on-year, but that was down from a 20% annual gain in November. A slump in car sales to China was one of the factors.
Shares in the British shoemaker Dr. Martin have taken a step backwards after the company issued a profit warning. The firm said significant operational issues at its new United States distribution centre could reduce annual profit by between $20 and $30 million, as well as having a knock-on effect into next year.
British online fashion retailer Boohoo says revenue fell 11% in its key Christmas trading period. That was partly due to longer delivery times and more shoppers using high street stores after the end of COVID restrictions. Sales were down 13% across the whole of 2022, prompting the brand to adjust its forecast for the coming year.
The United States government has hit its $31.4 trillion borrowing limit, prompting the US Treasury to start extraordinary measures to avoid defaulting on its debt. This sets the stage for a bitter fight over the government's budget, pitching the Republican-controlled House of Representatives against President Joe Biden's Democratic Party. There's concern this could lead to a fiscal crisis within months. Let's talk to our correspondent, John Terrett, watching events in New York. John, this will obviously run and run, but we've been here before, haven't we, time and again?
You know, we certainly have, and this is a story that is almost completely unique to the United States. I don't think there's another country in the world, there might be one, maybe two at the most, where they require their parliament, or in this case, of course, the Congress, to vote in order to raise the deficit limit and the debt ceiling. Now, the deficit is how much more the government spends than it brings in, and the debt, of course, is everything that follows after that. Now, you may remember back in December, just a couple of weeks ago, there was a stopgap bill that went through the Congress, which turned into an omnibus bill, a huge one, with lots of spending that's very dear to President Biden's heart. And that basically kept the government open. But that was the deficit. We're talking now about the debt ceiling, which is something slightly different. Now, I have to tell you, this story does have the potential to do irreparable harm. It really does. But it's a bit of a slow burner. And I point as my example of that to the fact that Janet Yellen, who's the Treasury Secretary, is in Africa for the next 10 days. So clearly the world isn't going to fall apart over this weekend. This is a story that's going to run and run, as you said. Now, regarding the debt ceiling, it's obviously the amount of debt that the Congress is comfortable carrying. It went up in President Trump's era, and then in 2021 there was a $2.2 trillion increase to $31.4 trillion, and that is what has just been exceeded this last hour. Now, that means that the Treasury is already working on extraordinary measures in order to keep the government funded. In theory, America now can't pay all of her bills. But in practice, what's going to happen is the Treasury will be robbing Peter to pay Paul, finagling the finances, and just eking things out. And they've got until June of this year in order to do that. So today we have all the markets down by about 1%. I think they're more concerned about worries about recession and the Federal Reserve overshooting with its interest rate hikes. But the bond market is reacting. The 10 and the 2-year are up quite significantly, and that is a direct result of what has just happened. Jamie.
Finagling there may be, John, but this will be a big fight on this renewal process on prime-time TV, presumably.
Exactly, and that is the big difference. And this is what we don't, it's unknowable. We simply don't know. I mean, I've said many times on our program before that this democracy here is a made-for-primetime TV democracy. I mean, it just is. And the problem we've got this time around in not knowing is that there are Trump disruptors who were elected in the midterm elections, particularly in the House, and they are the ones who delayed the election of the Speaker of the House. the boss of the House, if you will, Kevin McCarthy, barely 2 weeks ago. Now, they got some extraordinary concessions in return for him holding the Speaker's gavel, and we know that they want concessions on spending this time round, spending cuts and concessions. They think that the bills that President Biden has been passing in the last 2 years have contributed to inflation here. Biden himself says we're not messing around here, we're not going to give any ground. He says this is not a political football, and he's seeking a bipartisan conclusion to this. But the fight could go on and be equally as bitter as the one a couple of weeks ago regarding the election of the Speaker in the House, never mind the Senate, although the Senate is very different. Basically, the battle will be in the House.
John, what are the real-world consequences of all this? It obviously excites people who write political and economic treatises and taxation and so on. But I mean, in the real world, what are the practical effects of a debt ceiling breach?
Well, here's a good factoid for you. It's been raised 74 times since 1962. That's more than twice a year, isn't it? I think it is, really, basically. Nothing may happen for a while, but what will happen is the government will start closing down things that people notice. So they'll stop cutting Social Security checks, Medicare checks. You won't be able to visit parks like Yellowstone and stuff like that. In theory, the government may not be able to pay the interest on the bonds, which would bring into doubt the full faith and credit of the United States. But the truth is, Jamie, in modern times, in our lifetime, the US has never actually defaulted. It's come very, very close. In 2011, there was a similar crisis. It didn't default, but the US did lose its AAA credit rating. And that, at the time, rattled the market, sent stocks sinking, and hurt some people's savings, which is why I say, although this is a slow burner, it has potential to do irreparable harm. Jamie?
John, thank you. Our correspondent, John Terrace, in New York.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead. The big names in international politics sit down in our interview chair in Davos. And what do they see ahead?
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and a bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans? Grey rhinos? And unicorn companies? Make sense of it all with Global Business, only on CGTN.
There's a new agenda for a new world, accelerating change in almost every part of our lives. It's shifting the norms of how we work, travel, and connect. How we think, interact, and develop. It's a new reality, a new agenda with me, Juliet Mann.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe. And do remember that CGTN is available to watch for free on all the major digital platforms, on Smart TV or online on Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube, Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app, and in the UK on Freeview.
trying to rebound from the pandemic, global growth and the need for trade links, all under discussion at the World Economic Forum in Davos.
But with rising protectionism and the war in Ukraine, some are pessimistic about the future, as our correspondent Juliet Mann has been finding out. Juliet, you're in Davos this year, of course, and the theme of the meeting there is a cooperation in a fragmented world. We can agree on it being a fragmented world, but is there much cooperation?
To a degree. It's been a very busy day, another busy day at Davos at the World Economic Forum. But once you get past the noise of those miserable headlines about global economic slowdown, the cost of living crisis, climate crisis, energy crisis, food insecurity, there are some interesting conversations, calm and measured conversations taking place on the sidelines that give you a sense that there might be some concerted effort towards some collaboration, but not is anything getting done? Is this going to turn into action? And not everyone's convinced that all this big talk at Davos is going to lead to big stuff happening. There are, though, some areas where cooperation is already taking place. Think about renewables, think of agri-tech, and think of healthcare. In fact, that brings me to when I was talking to Jose Manuel Barroso, who's the chairman of Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance. And we talked quite a lot about that and how countries talking and coming together was really important to get the vaccine and to spread that out across the world. Of course, Jose Manuel Barroso, you'll also know as a former European Commissioner. Before that, he was the Prime Minister of Portugal. Before that, when I first met him, he was Portugal's Foreign Minister. And I'm sounding a little bit like John Terrett now, but bear with me, because, we had a really, really interesting and in-depth conversation about such a range of topics. We started talking about the pandemic, but we talked about the war in Ukraine. We talked about the economy. We talked about trade, energy security, all of those things. It was so interesting. But, he said that the war in Ukraine and the global community's inability to put an end to it has completely changed the global atmosphere, and we can't pretend that it hasn't. And he said, look, I'm sorry, I can't give you a more optimistic view. Those cleavages are only going to get deeper, and that's going to affect trade. Take a listen.
There are more and more appeals for protectionism in many parts of the world. I'm not now going to make a kind of a blame game. I don't want to go on that matter now. But it's quite clear that we are seeing now more trends for protectionism globally. That's quite clear. And this was aggravated by the invasion of Ukraine by Russia very strongly, and in Europe as well. And the pandemic also has highlighted some of the vaccine nationalism. So there is always this, let's say, struggle between flux and friction. The flux of goods, of capital, of investment, of ideas, of people, flux, and there is friction. The friction of narrow nationalism, protectionism, and at the end, war. And what we are seeing now in the center of Europe is a war. And of course, that changes the international climate fundamentally.
As far back as 2005, you said that China's development and growth was going to be really important for the global economy and should be regarded as an opportunity rather than a threat. Do you still think that? Do you think that others heard that call?
I think yes. I think the growth of China, by the way, it is one of the most important, if not the most important ever in mankind history, of spectacular growth in a relatively short period, was first of all good for Chinese people, because hundreds of millions of people were freeing themselves from poverty, so that's good when such a big part of mankind gets in a better position. And also for the global economy it is good. The question now is how to manage that in a way that is perceived as good for the rest of the world. And unfortunately, in the recent times, we are seeing more geopolitical friction, namely between the United States and China. And so the question is how to make global growth not a threat to others. And this requires political leadership and wisdom. And that's where we are now. And frankly, I'm not very optimistic.
That was Jose Manuel Barroso speaking to me earlier, and you can see that interview in full on a future agenda on CGTN. Now, you know, it's minus 12 degrees here. It's getting chillier. So let's talk to Milton Cheng, who's the global chair of Baker McKenzie, about whether he's finding things frosty at this ref, or if you're getting a warmer feeling. Great to see you. Glad you came.
Hello, Juliet. Well, glad to be here, despite minus 12. Look, I've had a really interesting few days here. Had the opportunity to be on a couple of panels, one for another network about China's reopening, and one just this morning on geography of diversity, talking about how organizations manage diversity across a global platform. But, you know, it's one thing that struck me in the discussions and the events that I've been able to attend is that even though people have had their differences in recent months and years, there is a strong desire to cooperate on tackling climate change, on embracing and adapting to technology, and on building an inclusive global economy despite differences.
So you think things are warming up, but I wanted to talk about in terms of where you're doing business, because you've said before that China's a market not to be ignored, although things didn't play out as you expected in 2022. So what's your take on China's economic and investment potential now, especially now it's opening up?
Well, I think, I mean, you'll have heard this from others as well. China's reopening up to the world, I think, will be probably the single biggest economic event for this year. I am very optimistic, as I said on my panel a couple of days ago. The Chinese market, the consumer market, is huge potential. We're already seeing with our client work, clients contacting us to revive deals, both going into China and coming out of China. So we're feeling optimistic.
Now, the theme, as we've been discussing, of the summit is cooperation in a fragmented world. But when you look at issues like the US's Inflation Reduction Act and the chip war against China, the world doesn't feel that cooperative, does it?
Well, you know, look, we've been around for more than 70 years. We are committed to globalization. We feel that at Baker McKenzie, our role is to help build bridges across cultures, across differences, and to help dialogue, help interpretation. I think whether or not there are differences in values, systems, and so on, there is an underlying need that's recognized for cooperation because trade, cooperation across markets ultimately is win-win. So it's a question of finding what is that way.
You mentioned climate as being a big thread that's running through Davos. The IEA here said that the political will to tackle climate crises is lacking. Do you think it's lacking?
Well, you know, I think my views have become less worried after these few days. In some of the discussions I had, I think I'm encouraged to see that there is clear dialogue. Now, of course, people may disagree, sometimes a difference of opinion as to the way to go about it, the Inflation Reduction Act or other things that are happening. But there is an underlying recognition, especially after our experience from the last couple of years, that this must be tackled.
And what about in opportunities? What's the focus for you this year? Supply chain restructuring, energy transition, healthcare?
All of the above. Supply chain restructuring, and all of the above, also digital transformation. I think my focus for the next 12 months at least is sort of the 3 Res: reglobalization, the return to work, and recession. Now, on the first and the third, I think we are well placed. We feel we're hedged with our broad practice. On return to work, I think all of us know that we have to be more flexible, and that's how we're going to try and approach it this year.
Milton Cheng, it's always a pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much indeed. That's Milton Cheng. Now, I was talking to Rebecca Greenspan earlier. She's the head of the UN Centre for Trade and Development. And she's got a really, really long shopping list of all the things that she wants from global leaders in terms of collaboration, in terms of cooperation. And you'll be able to see that interview on a future agenda. But she said that one bit of good news for 2023 is China. And she said, you must have felt that. You must have felt that here in Davos. And we talked about China's Belt and Road Initiative, you know, probably the world's biggest public-private cooperation setup, where China is investing billions or underwriting billions of infrastructure projects, from railways to roads to ports to bridges, all along the old Silk Road linking China to Europe. Well, the Belt and Road project is having its 10th anniversary this year. Let's take a look at some of the big projects.
China to Europe freight trains now travel on 82 routes, starting in cities like Shanghai before making their way through Siberia, southern Russia and Kazakhstan into Europe. The trains stop in at least 200 cities across 24 European countries, meaning the transport network covers most of the continent. From the beginning of 2022 to July, the number of train journeys grew to nearly 9,000. That's a 3% increase on the same period in the previous year. And in the same time frame, cargo being delivered from China into Europe increased by 4%. The bulk of freight is destined for sectors including car manufacturing, retail and fashion, and technology. Over 50,000 kinds of goods are carried, from grain to clothing to car parts. The goods are bound for countries like France, the UK, the Netherlands, Spain, and as far away as Norway. China's first and largest Belt and Road project in Europe is the Greek port of Piraeus, where Chinese investment helped create more than 10,000 jobs. In November, the port recorded a profit jump of 28% in the first 9 months of the year. But it's sub-Saharan Africa which is home to the highest number of Belt and Road investments, with 43 infrastructure projects. New bridges, highways and airports are connecting the continent like never before. This includes its first ever high-speed rail line between Mombasa and Nairobi.
Well, I've been speaking to not one but two presidents of countries who are already undertaking Belt and Road projects with China, the president of Costa Rica and the president of Ecuador. Let's listen in first of all to the president of Ecuador, who's just signed a new trade deal with China. And I asked what impact that might have on his relationship with other countries in the region, particularly the United States.
Nuestra relación con Estados Unidos también es una relación de gran acercamiento.
Our relations with the United States have been very close for many years, so there's no reason why our relationship with China should affect that. They know we're negotiating with China.
Ellos saben que estamos negociando con la China y pues no tiene por qué cambiar. Ahora, respecto de
In relation to the rest of Latin America, Ecuador wanted to join the Pacific Alliance, but we couldn't, because we couldn't agree a free trade deal with Mexico, and that's a precondition for joining the Pacific Alliance. So since we can't join for the moment, we've gone straight to China.
Que es una condición fundamental para el ingreso a la Alianza del Pacífico. Pero bueno, como no vamos a poder entrar por ahora a la Alianza del Pacífico.
And we've also made progress in trade agreements with South Korea, Costa Rica, Panama and the Dominican Republic. And we're going to seek agreements with Japan and with Canada. We had this clear objective because the world is a big opportunity for Ecuador.
Ecuadorian President Guillermo Lasso there. But I also spoke to Costa Rica's President Rodrigo Chavez, and he said he really hopes that there's scope for more global cooperation on the big issues.
We think that what matters in the world is that all engines of growth are functioning, and which are the big centers of economic sort of gravitational force: the US, Europe, and China. So the fact that China hopefully will reopen, hopefully will go back to high rates of growth, is going to help everybody in the world, especially if those big economic centers collaborate.
The Congress Centre is full. It's really hard to get a table for one-on-one conversations. The lounges are really, really crammed, and that's why a lot of wining and dining takes place on the sidelines and on the fringes of the Davos World Economic Forum. The CBI, the Confederation of British Industry, put on a lunch where Business Secretary, the UK's Business Secretary, Grant Shapps, said that Britain's open for business, but that the government should think bigger, take more risk. But you know what, Robin and Jamie, I think it's so interesting that the only G7 leader not just a member of the cabinet, leader that came to Davos this year was Germany's Olaf Scholz. Think about that one. We'll have more from Davos tomorrow.
We certainly will. Juliet Mann in Davos, thank you very much. And as Juliet said there, more from the final day of the World Economic Forum on our programme tomorrow.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, Russia's former president warns the West to defeat by conventional military means could lead to nuclear war.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there. To see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you. All around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London, China Global Television Network. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference. Facing the unknown is always difficult. In a world in turmoil, it's easy to lose orientation. But when the storms come, we have to see the possibilities, reinvent, find new opportunities, discover a path forward. CGTN. See the difference.
What do we mean when we talk about the difference? The difference is in the detail, the background,
defense ministers from
the wider angle and perspective of every story. Wherever the story may be. CGTN. See the difference.
Hello, welcome back to Global Business Europe with Jamie Owen and Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. Protests and strikes across France over government plans to raise the age of retirement.
The US government hits its $31 trillion borrowing limit amid a standoff between Republicans and Democrats.
And New Zealand's Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, says she's stepping down in a surprise move months ahead of the general election. It's his first day in the job, and Germany's new defence minister has held talks with his American counterpart as pressure builds on Berlin to provide battle tanks to Ukraine.
Boris Pistorius hosted US Defence Secretary Lloyd Austin in the capital as the two allies remain at loggerheads over the transfer of German-made tanks. Kyiv has pleaded with the West to send the heavy weapons, saying it could decide the war. Well, let's talk to our correspondent Trent Murray in Berlin. Something of a busy first day for Germany's new defence minister.
Yeah, it certainly is, Robin. A heavy in-tray, a long to-do list for Minister Pistorius, but he has got straight down to business. He was sworn in by the President this morning, then into the Bundestag for the same process, and then off for that meeting with Secretary Lloyd Austin. And it seems that the priority right now for him is just trying to soothe over some diplomatic disagreements that have emerged between Germany and Washington. This has all got to do with the question of whether to send Western main battle tanks into Ukraine. Kyiv certainly wants them. There's a lot of European ones called the Leopard 2, but they are German-made meaning Olaf Scholz gets a veto on whether they can go into Ukraine, regardless of which country wants to send them. We know Poland and Finland are very keen, but Scholz is saying he will only allow them to go in if the Americans send their own US version, which is called the Abrams. And from what we understand, the Pentagon is just not ready to do that. And so we have got this standoff right now. All the while, Kyiv is just saying we really need these tanks now to prepare for an expected offensive from the Russians in the spring. It will all form part of a big set of discussions taking place at the Ramstein Air Force Base tomorrow.
But Trent, defence ministers from the UK, Poland and the Baltic countries joining efforts to send tanks.
Yeah, Robin, and this is only breaking in the past hour or so. The timing very interesting because, as I say, we've got that big meeting happening at the Ramstein Air Force Base tomorrow, and we understand 9 nations have come out, including Britain, Poland and the Netherlands, with a very strong statement. Let me just read a little bit of it to you. We commit to collectively pursuing delivery of an unprecedented set of donations, and this is the key part, including main battle tanks, artillery, air defence, ammunition and infantry fighting vehicles to Ukraine's defence. Now, those group of nations include all of the Baltic states, the Netherlands, which is an interesting one because we've not really heard them be very vocal on this before. So clearly what is happening now is the ground is being set for potentially a pretty fiery meeting tomorrow at Ramstein, with a number of nations now lining up against Germany to sort of say, look, enough is enough. If we want to send these main battle tanks in, you may have made them, but we bought them. We want to give them to Ukraine, so lift your veto. It'll be very interesting to watch, and of course there'll be full coverage right here on CGTN.
Yes, we will no doubt speak again tomorrow. Trent Murray in Berlin, thank you very much.
Well, ahead of that NATO meeting in Germany on Friday that Trent was talking about, Russia's former president, Dmitry Medvedev, has warned of nuclear war if Russian forces are defeated by conventional means. The Kremlin confirmed that his remarks were in line with its nuclear doctrine. Our correspondent Stuart Smith is in Moscow.
Dmitry Medvedev, in terms of political power, is given certain responsibilities. He's able to do diplomacy with certain countries. He is sent off to do specific missions on behalf of the president, but he's not someone that dictates nuclear policy for a start. So this is merely his observation on what he believes is possible. Now, his exact quote was, "Nuclear powers have not lost major conflicts on which depends their fate." His point being that a nuclear power, in his mind, cannot lose because it ultimately can always use a nuclear weapon. He said because of that, even if it seems that there is no use of nuclear weapons by other states in what Russia perceives to be its new territories, then a nuclear response could be valid. And from the point of Russia's nuclear doctrine, which Dmitry Peskov, the president's press secretary, said all the journalists should read, it is the case that when Russian territory is threatened, even by conventional means, Russia has the option to use nuclear weapons. The difficulty of using that to infer anything else is from the point of view of Moscow. Russian territory is already threatened because it annexed those 4 regions that were not under Russian control. However, Dmitry Peskov did not seem to want to use this as an opportunity to escalate things. He suggested that this was no more than an observation of Russia's current understanding. What did seem to frustrate officials in Moscow on Thursday was the suggestion that weapons and the United States could support weapons being used to target Crimea, something which still in the minds of Russian politicians, although officially no different from normal Russian territory, does seem to have a special status, especially compared to the new territories. Dmitry Peskov said that if Crimea is targeted as part of an effort to try to reclaim that, would bring the conflict to a new level. Russia's ambassador to the United States said that would not be left unanswered if indeed action does take place there. So Russian officials cautioning that it would be interpreting that as a major escalation.
So NATO chiefs of defence meeting in Brussels for a second day of talks ahead of Friday's wider gathering in Germany. Jamie Shea is former NATO Deputy Assistant Secretary-General for Emerging Security Challenges. Jamie, welcome back. Good to see you. Can I just first of all pick up on that Dmitry Medvedev story, an ally, of course, of President Putin, warning that NATO that a defeat of Russia in Ukraine could trigger a nuclear war. What are we to make of that?
Well, since the beginning of the conflict, Jamie, Dmitry Medvedev, who of course is a former president of Russia, has been going around making these very extreme, very provocative statements, which are then sort of reined in gently by Putin himself, by Defense Minister Shoigu, and other Russian leaders. It's interesting that in mentioning the possibility of a nuclear scenario as a response to a Russian conventional defeat, that Medvedev is sort of entertaining the idea that Russia may lose the war in Ukraine, whereas just yesterday, Putin in St. Petersburg, talking at an armaments factory and talking to veterans, was proclaiming absolute faith in the inevitability of Russian victory. So it's interesting to see if Russian leaders really have doubts about the wisdom of their strategy. But Putin, before Christmas, was disclaiming any notion of using nuclear weapons in Ukraine. He's the leader, and therefore I dismiss what Medvedev is saying is the usual sort of escalatory rhetoric, which is just trying to frighten us.
Just a reaction on this breaking news, the defence ministers from the UK, Poland and Baltics joining efforts to send tanks. I mean, the United States and Germany over the last few hours trying to resolve this standoff that so far prevented the West from sending heavy tanks to Ukraine as Kyiv pleads for the weapons to help it turn the tide of this war. Why has tanks been such a difficult issue to agree on amongst allies?
Well, Jamie, it generally shouldn't be, because the UK has already offered, as you know, 14 Challenger tanks. Many other countries in Europe, there are 20 countries, including Canada, that operate the Leopard 2, have all suggested that they would be willing to send some of those tanks. And the Germans were saying at the beginning that they didn't want to do it alone. Well, they're not doing it alone. You've got, as I mentioned, many other countries now offering those tanks. And if all of those 20 countries offer 10 each, that gets Ukraine up to 200, which is significantly close to the 300 benchmark, and it says that it needs to be able to turn the tide. And even if Germany isn't immediately ready to send its own Leopard 2 tanks, it can do two things. Number one, Jamie, it can lift those export license restrictions, which allow countries like Poland and Finland and others to go ahead, the Netherlands, Sweden, and so on. And secondly, it can reopen the production line of Leopard 2s, the Krauss-Maffei-Wegmann production line, because inevitably, as Ukraine uses those tanks, it's going to need spare parts, it's going to need maintenance and all of those kind of things. But my sense is that the Germans have got to step up on this, and within the German cabinet, there are many, for example, like the economics minister, who are supportive of the notion of providing those tanks. So let's see what happens at Ramstein tomorrow, and let's hope that the Germans are going to step up.
I don't know if you managed to hear our coverage from Davos. We were reporting just a few moments ago. The mood music from a lot of the international political community that we've been interviewing over the last couple of days has been pretty gloomy on Ukraine. What's your assessment all these months in? Where are we? Where is this going?
Well, I think it's gloomy, Jamie, to the extent that everybody realises that it wasn't going to be a short war. Both sides, paradoxically, finished last year in a strong position. The Ukrainians having recaptured territory, being given all of this extra US and allied military equipment, must feel confident that they can go on the offensive and regain territory. But the Russians finished in a strong position as well, in the sense that they are still sitting on quite a chunk of Ukraine and were able to dig in and bring in those 300,000 conscripts that they have mobilized and replaced their equipment. So I think both sides are sort of quite hopeful that they're going to have a good winter, as it were, and be in a position to go on the offensive in the spring. And I suppose, gloomy or not gloomy about the fate of the war, is going to depend upon, you know, who has the best winter and who emerges in the strongest position. But tanks for Ukraine will certainly, of course, give the Ukrainians, I think, more optimism that they can regain much more territory as the snows in the Donbass begin to thaw.
Jamie, good to talk to you. Thanks so much for coming back on the programme. Jamie Shea, former NATO Deputy Assistant Secretary General. Good to speak to you.
Thank you, Jamie.
China says the number of COVID patients in need of critical care has fallen rapidly since the start of the year. The National Health Commission says there are 40% fewer COVID patients in clinics and hospitals than there were 3 weeks ago. It comes as millions of people travel for Lunar New Year celebrations after years of COVID restrictions.
2 people have died in a stampede at a football stadium in Iraq. Thousands of fans without tickets were trying to get into the ground in the city of Basra for the final of the Gulf Cup between Iraq and Oman. Medical teams say dozens of people have been injured. It's the first time Iraq has hosted this tournament since 1979.
The trial of Sicilian mafia boss Matteo Messina Denaro has been postponed after he declined to appear via video link at his first hearing. Denaro is being held in a high-security jail in Italy, accused of dozens of killings. Italian police also discovered a second hideout bunker used by Denaro at the back of a wardrobe with jewellery and silverware inside. New Zealand's Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern is to step down in February, meaning she won't lead her party into October's election. Ardern made history in 2017 as the country's youngest head of government in a century and the world's youngest female leader at the time. While in office, she saw the country through the pandemic, the Christchurch mosque shootings and a deadly volcanic eruption.
The only interesting angle that you will find is that after going on 6 years of some big challenges, I am human. Politicians are human. We give all that we can for as long as we can, and then it's time. And for me, it's time.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, family, food and festivities. Cooking up a feast of colourful cuisine for Chinese New Year.
Events have consequences. Words create impact.
Unprecedented scenes that we saw.
The clean-up operation is now well and truly underway.
Parts of southern Europe remain in a state of emergency.
Context gives meaning. People make history.
Far more than 1,000 people have come here today.
But authorities are still on high alert.
So now we've actually become the border on this road.
A complex world demands a comprehensive view.
But with the cleanup efforts more or less under control,
the economic impact is bound to ripple across the country.
There's plastic pollution everywhere.
Because the world today matters for your world tomorrow.
This is the living area of the crew.
The focus is family on future technologies.
Well, this is something completely different.
The world today, every day on CGTN.
Hello, welcome back to Global Business Europe. Spain and France have pressed the reset button on diplomatic relations.
Two countries have signed a new friendship and cooperation treaty, which they hope will strengthen their economic and political standing on the global stage. Our correspondent Ken Brown reports from Madrid.
A warm welcome between neighbours. Today, the leaders of Spain and France signing what was described as an historic friendship treaty to achieve common strategic objectives. The two share pressing issues, including the European energy crisis, the conflict in Ukraine, migration and defence.
This friendship treaty will define both of our countries, the relationships that we've been building in the past and present, but most importantly defines what we're aiming to become.
This is the first treaty of its kind since 1987. France wants to shore up support ahead of a potential trade dispute with the United States, with billions of dollars going to American companies as part of a green transition. Paris believes that this may create an unfair competitive advantage against the EU. Spain, for its part, believes that a tighter alliance with France will take it closer to the nucleus of European power. However, the treaty ceremony in Barcelona was not welcomed by all. An estimated 6,000 protesters gathered to show their Catalan independence movement is still alive, following recent comments from a Spanish government minister that their push for independence was over. Barcelona may have been chosen for the signing event to highlight a planned hydrogen pipeline connecting Barcelona with France's southern city of Marseille. Spain and Portugal aim to sell renewable energy to the wider European market with the help of France. The three nations have applied for significant EU subsidies.
We reaffirmed our commitment with this project that will benefit all of the EU. Hydrogen is one of the technologies with the most promising future. Hydrogen means sustainability, diversification and, most importantly nowadays, strategic autonomy.
A closer political alignment with France will also help Spain as it looks ahead to the summer when it begins its 6-month rotating presidency of the European Union. The treaty puts Spain on a par with Germany and Italy, which also have friendship agreements with France, as President Macron looks to secure Paris's place at the political heart of Europe. Ken Brown, CGTN, Madrid.
Family and food, the two essential ingredients for a successful Chinese New Year this weekend.
In northern China, colourful steamed buns known as huamo are a must for any celebrations. Our correspondent Hu Chao reports.
Having got up early in the morning, Zhang Qiaolan made nearly 200 steamed buns at her home before noon. The colorful steamed buns she makes are called huamo or flower buns, a traditional dish served in special occasions. Zhang says she learned the craft from her mother-in-law more than a decade ago.
I've gradually fallen in love with making huamo, while my mother-in-law's generation of craftspeople sticks to the old patterns. We now add new and more auspicious elements.
Zhang says she's having an influx of orders as the Lunar New Year approaches. Almost every day recently, at about 5 a.m., she got up to start her work, and her husband also gives her a hand. Making attractive and delicious huamo is not only labor-consuming, but also needs creative design and deft hands.
Well, I just tried a little bit here, but I found it's not easy as it looks. I guess it really needs days or even years of practices.
Making nice huamo requires great concentration and a calm mind. You can create anything as long as you keep calm.
Zhang says demand for her homemade huamo has been increasing.
The business is getting better year by year, much better than the previous years. Many people will send huamo as gifts to their friends and relatives in other cities.
Huamo in Wenxi County has a history of over 1,000 years. Now the county has nearly 1,000 craftspeople making huamo and 18 companies selling the food to cities across the country. The annual sales volumes reach 200 million yuan, or nearly $30 million. Wu Chao, CGTN, Shanxi Province.
And with just a few days to go until the Chinese New Year, CGTN has asked people from different countries to choose poems linked to the new season.
Sunday marks the start of the Year of the Rabbit. Children from Milburn Primary School in Northern Ireland have been showing off their Mandarin skills. That poem and many more feature on CGTN Europe's social media platforms, and check out europe.cgtn.com for your guide to the Spring Festival.
The headlines again. Protests and strikes across France over government plans to raise the age of retirement.
On other headlines, the United States government hits its $31 trillion borrowing limit amid a standoff between Republicans and Democrats.
And New Zealand's Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern says she's stepping down in a surprise move months ahead of an election.
And that's it for Global Business Europe. Thank you for watching.
More on all our stories at europe.cgtn.com, and do follow CGTN Europe on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram. We're on Smart TV apps, Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube, Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app, and in the UK on Freeview.
Coming up next on CGTN, it's Africa Live. We'll see you again tomorrow, same time, same place. From all of the team in London, it's goodbye.
Goodbye.